It's been a year of challenges, but it's also been a year of enormous progress.
US President Joe Biden talking about his first year in office. Going into year two, what progress has his administration made and what challenges lie ahead? Hello, I'm Arlen Schneider and this is The Heat. It's been a year since Joe Biden took office as the 46th U.S. president. In that time, his administration has overseen the creation of 6.4 million new jobs, decreased unemployment, passed a $1.9 trillion package of coronavirus relief, and the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. But the pandemic is still raging and inflation is at 7%, a 40-year high. CGTN's Nathan King looks back at the first year of the Biden presidency.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
What a difference a year makes. President Biden swept into office with big plans and a pledge to heal the deep divisions in U.S. politics and society. Early successes in passing a bipartisan bill for COVID relief and infrastructure spending on a scale not seen in decades led to comparisons to Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal that helped lift the U.S. out of the Great Depression. But a surge in COVID cases and deaths and an inability to unite his own party in the face of united opposition from Republicans led to legislative gridlock in Congress on everything from tackling climate change to social welfare spending and protecting voting rights. Defending his record, however, Biden used a near 2-hour press conference to say he will engage with the U.S. public more in his second year in office.
There's three things I'm going to do differently. Now that I've gotten the critical crises out of the way in the sense of that movement, knowing exactly where we're going. Number one, I'm going to get out of this place more often. I'm going to go out and talk to the public. I'm going to do public fora. I'm going to interface with them. I'm going to make the cases of what we've already done, why it's important, and what will happen if they support what else I want to do.
But plunging poll numbers and wafer-thin majorities in Congress threatened by upcoming midterm elections in November mean that the president may have just a few months to avoid becoming what political pundits here call a lame duck president. On foreign policy too, Biden is scoring low. A disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan, an inability to revive the Iran nuclear deal and potential confrontation with Russia over Ukraine are overshadowing other positive developments for the US. For example, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord and re-engagement with allies from Asia to Europe. On China, however, many of the Trump-era policies, from trade to Taiwan to interference on human rights, remain in place. And after 4 years of the tumultuous Trump presidency, Biden's perceived professionalism was considered a plus. But more than 1 million cases of COVID on a record-shattering day on January the 3rd, coupled with delays in adequate testing and mask supply, have called that professionalism into question. And US vaccination rates trail those of other developed nations. And a strong economic recovery is clouded by soaring inflation, leaving many Americans in a sour mood.
I have never felt more discouraged and disillusioned with the state of electoral politics in the past year and change. I think Biden entered office, it was kind of a big hopeful moment. He seemed he was ready to govern broadly, even if he might not necessarily have been my candidate in the primary. I had some hopes about it.
A year into this administration and the deep divide from everything in America, from elections to vaccines, continues to deepen. It is possible that Joe Biden could turn around his political fortunes for the midterms and for his potential re-election bid in 2024. But the deep divisions in American society are expected to last longer than his first term. Well beyond that, indeed. Nathan King, CGTN, at the White House.
Okay, to talk about the first year of the Biden presidency, let's bring in our panel. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Jacquie Luqman is the co-host of By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik. Melik Abdul is a political analyst, writer, and Republican strategist. Rafael Bernal is a reporter for The Hill newspaper. And from Arlington, Virginia, Bill Schneider is Professor Emeritus at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University and author of Standoff, How America Became Ungovernable. Welcome to all of you to the show. And Bill Schneider, it's been a tough year for the president. He did get that infrastructure bill passed, as we just heard. But most of the other legislation is stuck in Congress right now. And as we just heard as well, inflation is going up. Questions also swirling about his age, his ability to govern, to be president. He will be 80 this year. And of course, there are all these very disturbing questions being raised about the future of democracy in the United States. But on balance, what's your assessment of his first year?
Not great. It's been okay. I mean, there has been one disaster which really doomed him, and that was the withdrawal from Afghanistan. America lost a war. When any country loses a war, there's going to be a political repercussion, and that's what's happening in the United States. Biden's decline started in August when the United States had that humiliating withdrawal from Afghanistan. Ever since then, things have been unraveling, and people are very conscious of the lack of progress on the coronavirus. There has been progress, but not enough. On climate change, the economy has made progress, but there are still some serious problems. And most conspicuously on race relations, where there's still a lot of discontent. So it all started with Afghanistan.
And on domestic policy, Bill, what do you make of the fact that he's not been able to get these bills through Congress?
Well, that's the state of American politics. People talk about the division, the polarization of the United States, as if this is something that came in with Biden. It didn't. It didn't even come in with Donald Trump. It came in the 1960s. It's over 50 years old. The division of American politics goes way back to Richard Nixon and Lyndon Johnson. It had to do with the introduction of the race issue in America and religious factors like abortion becoming big issues in the United States. This division is very old. Biden is the victim of it, but it didn't originate with him. Trump made it worse, but it didn't originate with him either. It's a very old theme in American politics, and Biden is really suffering from it. His biggest problem, Democrats don't have enough votes in Congress to pass his agenda. When Roosevelt was president, he had a big majority in Congress. When Lyndon Johnson was president, he had huge majorities in Congress, and he could get anything he wanted. With Biden as president, Congress is evenly divided, and it's proven to be very hard for him to be another Roosevelt or another Lyndon Johnson.
Jacquie, great to have you with us. Many attribute Biden's victory in the 2020 election to the fact that he was not Trump. What is your view on his first year? And if we look, for instance, at the pandemic, I mean, he inherited a raging pandemic, we should say, but he came in promising to fix that. Well, he hasn't. I mean, how will that be looked at in his first year?
Well, I think we are already seeing how it will be looked at. People are quite reasonably disgusted and very, very disappointed with the fact that the Biden administration, Biden and Harris, waited an entire year before he did what he excoriated Trump for not doing. And to be clear, I have no positive things to say about Donald Trump, but I remember when Biden made such a big deal, accurately so, about Trump's lack of ramping up testing and not providing PPE and not triggering the Defense Production Act to produce masks, to give not just to medical professionals, but to everyone. And Biden did not come into his administration doing that, making those things the first things he did. He waited an entire year. And the process for receiving these free tests really makes no sense. When I get junk mail in my mailbox that I don't ask for every couple of days, why do I have to go to a website run by the U.S. Postal Service to request only 4 tests? So the way Biden responded to the pandemic, as opposed to the way he criticized Trump for responding to the pandemic when Biden was campaigning, are very, very different. And it's one of those things that everybody can quite easily see and agree on, that it is very insufficient and a huge disappointment from his first year in office.
And Jacquie, he also suffered something of a defeat at the U.S. Supreme Court when it struck down his employer vaccine mandate. How will that impact him?
Well, I think the problem with the mandate was that this government under Trump and Biden didn't do anything to provide for people in order to be able to break the chain of transmission for this virus. So there was all this focus on only vaccines. There was nothing this government did to provide, as I said, people with PPE, with masks, with sanitizer, with anything to keep them safe. Yes, there were some COVID relief checks, but even Biden hedged on that $2,000 promise that he made us, and we only got $1,400, and he did some weird math about that. So now, instead of doing what he said he would do to help this country move past this virus, stop the spread of the virus, to stop variants from emerging, all he did was focus on vaccines, vaccines, vaccines. And then he goes directly to mandates. So people were very upset with that the only thing he did was to push vaccines and then to push mandates, but again, provide nothing for people in between to stay safe, uh, especially if they were not able to go into work because there are people who are immunocompromised who cannot. And that's all his administration has done. So I think that is also going to dog him for quite a while, even if people can't quite articulate why they hate the mandate so much.
Right.
I don't think it's so much that people are like, oh, I don't like the government telling me what to do. I think people have a difficult time making the connection that this was all the government did. It just vaccines and then mandates and nothing to really help people.
Melik, Abdul, great to have you with us again. As I said a moment ago, much of the president's legislative agenda is stuck in Congress. The Democrats just don't have the votes. The president has seen that two of his own members in the Senate have voted against him. But if we also look at the Republican Party, it stood unified, absolutely solid against Democrat proposals. And that's led some commentators to say, or ask the question rather, is it important for Republicans to make sure Biden fails, or do they really want to help the American people? This is what President Biden himself said. Let's listen.
One thing I haven't been able to do so far is get my Republican friends to get in the game of making things better in this country. I did not anticipate that there'd be such a stalwart effort to make sure that the most important thing was that President Biden didn't get anything done. Think about this. What are Republicans for? What are they for? Name me one thing they're for.
So, Melik, that's a fair question, isn't it? I mean, what are Republicans for?
No, this is pretty much what you see in politics all the time. Obviously, Joe Biden is hemorrhaging in the polls, and so therefore he has to actually cast doubt or criticize what the Republican Party is doing, even though within his own party, as we just found out, only 48% of the number of those who believe that he should actually run for re-election in 2024. The fact is that what the Biden administration is doing, for the most part, is consistent with other administrations have done, those very smaller things that we don't get to actually talk about on television. I always say that these are not the sexy things that the government does to keep the government working and fund programs across the board. That's pretty much what the Biden administration has done. And he has done that, just like Donald Trump's administration has done it. But the thing is that the problem with Joe Biden is that he overpromised and underdelivered. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the results of that now. So many of the big things that Biden talked about, voting rights, he came into office saying that he was no longer going to create his police commission. And so he gave us an actual date and said that the police reform bill had to be passed by the anniversary of George Floyd's death. Then he went on to say that we would be able to tackle COVID by July 4th. Then he now has another date where he said that the voting rights bill that they're working on would need to be passed by MLK's Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday.
Yeah.
Joe Biden is responsible for many of these things, but of course, he's a partisan and it's intellectually dishonest to say that Republicans actually haven't done anything, because there are many things that have actually passed out of Congress, in addition to just those things that we know about, such as the infrastructure package. But as part of that infrastructure package, many of those things passed out of committee. So the almost $40 billion that Republicans co-signed for the infrastructure package, or the 300 million surface infrastructure package.
Right.
All of these things Republicans have actually supported, even funding our HBCUs. So it's not honest to say, but I understand the political motivation to push this idea that somehow Republicans aren't doing anything but just sitting back and criticizing Democrats. It's not factually correct, but I understand why people say it.
Rafael, Bernal, let's talk about immigration and the president's record on immigration. Biden promised to implement a more humane asylum system on immigration, but not much came of that. In fact, he continued a Trump-era practice, a policy rather, of using a healthcare provision to expel people. I mean, how big a disappointment is that for immigration advocates in this country?
Well, it's huge, and it's really eclipsed all of the positive things from the view of immigration advocates that Biden has done, getting rid of a public charge rule, changing the way immigration is enforced in the interior of the country. You know, the ICE agents are even more careful with sensitive locations now than they are statutorily supposed to be, and definitely more respectful in that sense than they were under Trump. But then you have these two rules around asylum, the so-called Remain in Mexico program and the Title 42 that allows the Biden administration to quickly expel anyone who crosses the border, presumably because of the pandemic. But there's really, I mean, we know it's not because of the pandemic, because sometimes people are in detention longer than the quarantine period and they're still expelled. And this is especially the case with Haitians. I think as much as the Afghanistan withdrawal was a turning point for the Biden presidency in general, and sort of the moment where things began to get sour, the management of the 15,000 Haitians under that bridge in Del Rio, Texas, was the turning point on immigration. And since then, the Biden administration has expelled more than 15,000 Haitians without allowing them to apply for asylum. And those dark marks are just very hard to overcome for immigration advocates.
What could the president have done, Rafael, even if it was just executive action, to implement some kind of positive change in the immigration system, the least he could have done?
Well, the least he could have done was return to a pre-Trump conditions, because remember, Trump didn't really actually get anything legislatively done on immigration. So the statute for pre-Trump conditions exists. DHS is actually still working in that sense, because the Trump people, led especially by Stephen Miller, were very effective in dismantling the immigration system. So it's not an easy task, but the big sin in Biden's immigration policy has been alienating his best allies in that field. Again, by these two moves, for instance, with the Haitians, nobody really understands. His allies are positively baffled about the treatment of Haitians. Expelling 15,000 people to essentially a failed state is something that it's proven unforgivable, and the Biden administration is very intransigent about that point.
Bill Schneider, one of the big issues the president is facing right now, of course, is inflation, which is running at about 7%. It's causing problems for his administration. And if you add to that, there was a Gallup poll which was published just a few days ago, which shows a 9% swing to Republicans since Biden took office. When he took office, the Democrats had an advantage. Now that's evaporated. It's moved the other way. What does that tell us?
What it tells us is Biden has one big problem. He is seen as a weak president. There was a poll recently from Statista asking people, do you think President Biden is a strong president or a weak president? And by a sizable margin, 67 or 68% to 32%, Americans said Biden is a weak president. In fact, over 40% said he was a weak president. Only 12% called him a strong president. He has a big problem. There's no fear factor. No one worries about defying him with, with and being being called out for it. He is seen as a weak president. He's weak with Congress. He can't get them to pass what he wants. Can you imagine how Lyndon Johnson would have treated Joe Manchin or Kirsten Sinema, Democrats in his own party who didn't support his program? People have to have presidents have to have a fear factor. Members of Congress and members of the party have to be worried about what's going to happen to them if they defy him. People defy Joe Biden all the time with impunity, and that has created, among columnists in the United States, an interesting phenomenon. He's constantly being compared with another weak president, and that was Jimmy Carter, who couldn't get his way on much of anything and was dismissed in favor of Ronald Reagan because Reagan was strong and Carter was weak. That is the core of Biden's problem. He's seen as a weak president.
Bill, that's an interesting analogy that you make there, with Lyndon Johnson and how he would have handled dissidents in his party. Why do you think Biden was not tough on people like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema?
It's not his nature, really. He honestly believed that bipartisanship would work, that it still exists. Here's some news, Mr. President. It doesn't exist anymore. There's very little bipartisanship. The parties agree on nothing. They dream of destroying it, particularly the Republicans dream of destroying the opposition. It was said of after the French Revolution that the right and the left did not want to win. They wanted to destroy each other. They wanted to annihilate each other. That's where we've come in American politics today, because our differences have become differences of fundamental values, not just differences of interests. And when politics is about basic values, then you get a very tense and very intense polarization.
Jacquie, Luqman, let's talk about another big piece of legislation in Congress. That is the voting rights bill. It was just defeated by Republicans and 2 Democrats. It was a blow to the Biden administration. In fact, the president tweeted, and I'm quoting here, "I am profoundly disappointed that the Senate has failed to stand up for our democracy. I am disappointed, but I am not deterred. We will continue to advance necessary legislation and push for Senate procedural changes that will protect the fundamental right to vote." Where does that leave voting rights right now?
It leaves voting rights exactly where that bill is, which is nowhere, dead in the water. I don't believe Joe Biden will do any more than what he has already done to affect any improvement in the situation with voting rights in this country. He hasn't addressed gerrymandering. He always talks kind of nebulously about voting rights and these pieces of legislation, but he doesn't do a good job of explaining what the problems are. We're talking about gerrymandering. We're talking about giving people the right to be poll watchers for the opposition, to intimidate people at the polls. These things still happen, to keep church people from doing souls to the polls drives. These things still happen in this country. And Joseph Biden, just like his response to the coronavirus, has been extremely lackluster and unenthusiastic about championing any kind of legislation to really tackle these issues. And it's not a surprise, honestly, from someone who spent his 40-year career in the Senate working with segregationists, because let's not forget that when Joe Biden when he says bipartisanship, he is building on that legacy that he has of working with people in the Senate who didn't want people who look like me to vote anyway. So we're still talking about him not understanding how, even though it is an inaccurate narrative, I absolutely agree. It's not the Republicans that's keeping Biden from passing any of his legislative goals. It is literally 2 Democrats who he refuses to call on the carpet. He is the president of the United States, the leader of their party, and he has not confronted these 2 and told them they need to stand in line or else. So I don't have any hope from Joe Biden and his administration to do any more on voting rights legislation, as faulty as that legislation and insufficient as it is. I don't see him doing any more to push that legislation forward. So I don't expect voting rights to change or
Right.
get better or improve during his administration.
Melik, Abdul, we often hear that, politics is about the art of compromise, especially when it comes to Congress. You're not going to get everything you want, but you will get something and legislation will pass. But when we look at these bills that are stuck in Congress right now, is there any way, do you see any room for compromise for them to pass, or are Republicans going to stand firm and say, not on our watch?
It depends on what it is. As I said, the government has continued to be funded. The government has funded things like HBCUs. Biden has actually poured money into minority business development. Republicans have actually been supportive of that.
Yeah.
If you even go back to the Trump years, what Trump was doing in office, whether it's thing around creating an energy consortium of schools in which HBCUs to participate in to actually deal with the climate change issue. As I said, these are the non-sexy things that government always does.
Right.
If the question is whether or not the big ticketed items, such as things like the voter rights legislation, well, no, that's not going anywhere, and it wasn't going anywhere even when Biden came into office. The big problem is that he overpromised, and so now, as he said in the press conference, literally on yesterday, when he addressed the issue of why did you wait so long to actually tackle voting rights,
Right.
what Biden said himself is that it wasn't the right time. So people need to know that they've been manipulated into believing many of these things were going to pass, and they just weren't. They had no chance at it at all.
Rafael, Bernal, I've only got a minute left, but there's talk now among Democrats of a reset, of changing direction to move these polls in a different direction. What needs to change?
Well, they need to be more aggressive, and Biden started his last few speeches. He's been a lot more aggressive, sort of the Biden that people wanted to see. Take a page from the Donald Trump playbook. Even though Donald Trump actually lost his midterms, he was seen by his base as somebody who was trying to fulfill his campaign promises. And as long as Biden's base doesn't see him as somebody who's at least trying, it's going to be much harder for Democrats to prevail with pretty bad political headwinds.
Right. And we need to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.